Okay, we'll call the meeting of Ways and Means to order. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Alderman Kennedy. Alderman Moore.
Here.
Alderman French.
Present.
Alderman Vaccaro.
Present.
Alderman Carter. Alderwoman Murphy. Here. Alderman Ogilvy.
Here.
Chairman Conway. 5 present. You have a quorum.
Before we get started, normally Ivy would be at these meetings, and if we can just have my understanding is she passed away, and if we could have a moment of silence for Ivy, and so. Thank you. We're going to start with Board Bill 177. Marlene, if you can go ahead and let us know what you got.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman and members of the committee. I present you with Board Bill 177. I'm asking for approval for a quitclaim deed for a project that I think we all will be excited about on Martin Luther King. There are some properties the city owns there, several lots that are adjacent to a building that has about a 125-year history with the electrical union. It was the original office where they organized and worked from. What we'd like to do is to make sure that the IBEW has the opportunity to refurbish the building, create a common space there for them to gather in, as well as create a museum that shows a lot of the old electrical parts and things like that, and also refurbish the original office that they operated out of on the second floor. I will pass around a rendering, and you will also see it again in a moment. But just to give you some idea exactly what has taken place thus far, and about, I believe about 3 months ago, I was approached with the understanding that this building was there, and they would like to have this building completed by next year. The International Union Convention will be here next year about this time. And so in acquiring the property, getting the building refurnished and ready for viewing by the time the convention is here next year means that they have to move quickly. And so that's why we're trying to move quickly to assist in that. The project itself is going to be right at about $1 million for the renovation cost of it, and it is going to really do a lot for Martin Luther King in that stretch there. It's right off of Leffingwell. Some people see on the other side of that street, you know where for those who are old enough to remember, where the fried drugstore used to be at that little triangle there at Martin Luther King. So it's right across the street from there. On the same side of the street, Crown Restaurant was at the corner. Then the furniture store is there, and then some more vacant lots. There are other vacant lots on the east side of the building that they'll also be acquiring as well. So they'll have ample parking, they'll have green space, and they'll be renovating the building. So I'm not going to give you a lot more detail because I think it comes from the heart, and I'd like to ask the speakers to have an opportunity to talk to you. The only other thing that I wanted to do was to show you the pictures of how this property looks now. It's going to be quite a difference. And as you can see, the cost for the property is $900.
Like my ward.
Yeah, that's true, sir. We all got some of it, unfortunately. So if it's okay, I'll turn it back over to you, sir.
Yeah, what we can do, I think we have John from IBEW that wanted to come up and talk. John, why don't you go ahead and come up? We'll do all the questions at the end, I think, because this seems pretty simple.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for the opportunity this morning. It's November of 1891. The gentleman we call our founding father now, his name was Henry Miller. He was born of German immigrant parents in Texas, and then he came to St. Louis in 1886. St. Louis at the time was a center of labor organizing. He worked at the St. Louis Exposition Hall, which held the 1888 Democratic Convention. It was one of the few buildings in St. Louis at the time that had electric lighting. A group of linemen got together and decided to form a union and affiliate with the American Federation of Labor, also in its infancy at that time. They then brought other union representatives from 9 other states here in St. Louis to hold and to form a national union. They held their first convention in this boarding house where Henry Miller was living in at the time. And what's interesting about it for us, the IBW, not only the historic value, but also is that we're rewriting our history in order to make the original convention seem more spectacular. They misrepresented the number of attendees and misrepresented the location. None of them had any money. And so they actually held the first convention in this boarding house and wrote our first constitution in this boarding house on what was 2728 Franklin Avenue. The lower level was retail originally. There was a Chinese laundry in one side of it and a saloon on the other side of it. And then Henry Miller, our founding father, actually lived in the second level. And so what's really exciting for us through this process is that we've purchased the property, and we were very concerned that the building was not structurally sound and we weren't going to be able to renovate it. However, we brought a structural engineer in. He toured the property, he looked at the foundation and found it to be in remarkably good condition. So a large portion of the man hours involved in the restoration is going to be the masonry restoration. A lot of the external brick will have to be relayed. That parge coat that you see on the exterior will have to be removed by hand, and then all the tuck pointing done. We're bringing the building up to ADA compliance. And this union that started with these 10 relatively poor guys at the time in a very dangerous occupation has grown to 750,000 members nationwide. 881 local unions in the United States, Canada, and Puerto Rico. And when the convention comes here next year, it will be our 39th convention. And we've got the full support of our international office in Washington, D.C. They couldn't be more excited about it. And we're going to start fundraising. We have I don't know what the circulation is from our international journal, but it goes to every member nationwide, and then the fundraising will actually start next month. So we're on a kind of a condensed time schedule. The process of acquiring the property from the original owners and then doing the requisite environmental studies and surveys did take a little longer than we expected, but now we're to this point where we're excited about it. And we're committed. Our international office in D.C. is committed to maintaining the property indefinitely. So, we'll have somebody there to give tours. It will be open to the public, and we will have artifacts in there from our founding fathers inside the museum itself. So, thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you. What I think I'll do is, Jim, did you have something, or just?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Just very briefly, first of all, Alderwoman, I'm Jim Garavaglia, and I'm the city's asset manager. I work out of the Comptroller's office. I don't know if we've ever formally met, but it's good to see you. I just wanted to say that the property that when we were approached, it is non-buildable. It is a it's 25 feet. It is not a buildable lot. So the small amount of money that the city will receive for that is based on the LRA pricing guidelines for that neighborhood for side yards or side lots that are not buildable. So But the Comptroller's office, again, stands in support of this as well, and we're happy to help the IBEW put this together as part of their museum and monument park.
Thank you. I think what I'll do is just open it up to questions, and it could be to any of the three. Alderman Moore
I got about 50 questions here.
for, should we bring them all up, or?
No, Marlene. Ms. Davis, what two streets is that between Jefferson and Beaumont, is it?
Jefferson and Leffingwell, if I'm not mistaken.
Is it it's on the same side of the street with Crown?
Yes, sir, it is, on the same side of the street.
I was looking at that picture. Those men on the poles, are they statues, or are they gonna be figurines? That's something gonna be
Statues.
That's gonna be displayed?
It's going to be wonderful. It really is.
And who's that boarding up that top window on that picture? That's the IBEW doing that? Surely it's not the city.
Oh, no.
I hope it's not the city, because
No.
then Mr. Brown would have to have all my top windows boarded up.
No. No. And you know, back in, one thing I have to say about that building, I remember before they got so strict, we used to do the second floors. We boarded the second floors. As a matter of fact, when I was director in Hyde Park, I even had some third floors boarded depending on the building and what the problems we had with the building. But now we're very strict and we don't do that anymore.
When do you expect the project to start?
Initial documents, blueprints, and drawings have already begun. And there's an initial investigation that's been done about the basement, foundation level, and lowering that's already been investigated in order to put the mechanical upgrades into the lower level. The general contractor's already entered the property and investigated the possibility of that. The first thing they will do is stabilize the walls. And so we had to do some work in order to get access to the surrounding properties for the shoring and the buttresses in order to stable the exterior masonry to ensure that that it could be restored.
How long will it take about?
They're hoping to have it done by September of next year. So it's going to be really fast track.
Will it be open to the public?
Yes.
It's free.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
The interior is only about 1,400 square foot per floor, so there's not a lot of interior space. The stuff that was added in the rear is going to be removed. The sort of the lean-to sort of structure in the back, garage-type structure in the back will be removed since it wasn't originally part of the property in the 1890s.
And those two lots on the side, that's what we see, the courtyard?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay, that's all I have. That was about 10.
Thank you. Alderman French.
No questions.
I have none. Alderman Carter.
Everything looks great. No questions.
Alderwoman Murphy.
Sounds wonderful.
Alderman Ogilvy. Well, then I would ask that we take a motion to pass Board Bill 177 out and let the due pass.
Second.
Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Alderman Kennedy, Alderman Moore,
Aye.
Alderman French, Alderman Vaccaro,
Aye.
Alderman Carter, Alderwoman Murphy, Alderman Ogilvy,
Aye.
Chairman Conway. 6 aye votes do pass.
Thank you guys for coming out.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, next we're going to have Board Bill 67 in front of us. And do we have a sign-up sheet? Is anybody going to speak on this? Okay. And the only thing that I think on this would be really nice if Paul Payne came down just to, so, and Patrick, are you planning on speaking on this? No. Okay. Would you mind I'd like to see Paul Payne come down if you wouldn't mind. No, I saw you out there, I thought I would ask to see. Okay, well, we're ready.
Sure, thank you. If I can bring the attention of the board to Board Bill 67. This is actually a pretty simple, but I would say substantive bill. One of the things that I think many people are surprised by is that as a deliberative body, as a legislative body, we do not consider the fiscal cost of legislation. Sometimes that has a minor impact, and sometimes, especially with some recent legislation that we passed down here, it has very significant impact. And we find ourselves, especially as a Ways and Means Committee, coming back once a year to look at our budget and realizing we're broke. And so along the way, we've allocated a lot of resources and haven't looked at the impact of these bills. Most every other legislative body, we had the state legislature, Congress, even other smaller boards of aldermen and city councils in the region do this. That we don't and that we haven't in our long history is one of those curiosities of City Hall. To the specific language of Board Bill 67, what Board Bill 67 would do is require a fiscal note be attached to every piece of legislation that we consider. The process described, which we will tweak a little bit, there's some language that I do want to change, but the process basically would be that either the budget office or our newly created, or newly funded, I should say, Office of Legislative Research in the Board of Aldermen would prepare these fiscal notes. As a bill is introduced, there will be somebody either in one of those two offices who will examine the fiscal impact. How much is this board bill going to cost? How much money is this pledging? How much additional revenue will the board bill generate? Not all fiscal impacts are negative. Some has a positive fiscal impact. And then that would be attached to the bill when we consider it in the committee level. The idea would also be that if there are any changes made to the bill on the committee level, that the fiscal note would then be updated to reflect those changes. And furthermore, if a change is made on the floor of the Board of Aldermen before the bill is perfected, then the fiscal note would also be updated. And so that's the way it would work. That's the idea of how it will work. And I just think it is better for us to have information, for the public to be able to know the costs of some of these bills, and for us to be able to make better and more informed decisions. One example is this. Recently we passed the minimum wage law in the city. And many of us were very concerned about the fiscal impact on the city, not just the employers or the people who employ people in the city, but as the city of St. Louis as an employer. We employ people. So if we raise wages, what would that fiscal impact be? We weren't given that information. It wasn't until after we passed the law that the budget director sent over some information. And when I saw that information, I thought that was very important stuff that we should have had before we even considered it. And it showed that even as we raise minimum wage to $11 an hour, it's going to affect our city budget by almost $500,000 a year. And if we were to raise it by $15 an hour, it would have cost us several millions of dollars a year. If we had that information in the beginning, I think that would have shaped the whole conversation a little differently. That's just one case. We have this bill coming up, obviously, about the stadium and the bonds that are going to be used to that. That's another bill that we should absolutely have this information as we're making these decisions. How much it's going to cost, what's it going to cost the citizens year after year after year until the bonds are paid off. So those are just two examples, but even smaller things like proposals. You know, this is one thing that the new chairman of HUDs has done, is require a fiscal impact on all development bills, which I thought was a move in the right direction, but that has just been up to the chairperson. It's not actually part of our rules or an ordinance. So Board Bill 67, a couple things I wanted to change. Number one, when I guess our former clerk prepared the bill, he included a language there that said that all board bills, this is the page 1, line 3, All said board bills requiring a fiscal note shall be referred to the Ways and Means Committee of the Board of Aldermen. I would scratch that. I don't think that's necessary. I think the idea here is that all bills would have a fiscal note. And so if it's a park bill, it would still have a fiscal note. If it's a bill that goes to HUDs, it would still have a fiscal note, and it would still go to its normal committee. So I would propose scratching that line. From starting on line 3, going to line 4, all said board bills requiring a fiscal note shall be referred to the Ways and Means Committee of the Board of Aldermen. I would scratch that line. And then on page 2, line 16, the original reads, "The City Budget Division shall be responsible for the preparation of all fiscal notes." In speaking to the chairman of this committee, he and I are both under the thinking that this process should be controlled at the Board of Aldermen. We shouldn't leave it up to the executive branch to prepare our fiscal notes for us. That gives them a lot of power to determine whether a bill looks attractive or not. And so what I would propose changing there is and then adding Office of Legislative Research, comma, in coordination with the City Budget Division, comma, shall be responsible for the preparation of all fiscal notes. So,
I'll get that after the meeting.
okay, so adding Office of Legislative Research in coordination with the city, but it's actually our office that is preparing the fiscal note. And as that line goes on to say, it says that all city departments, which would include the City Budget Division, and offices shall cooperate in providing any information necessary for the preparation of the fiscal note. Now, in relationship to this Office of Legislative Research, one of the things that we did recently, which I thought was a move in the right direction, was actually fund that. And so those positions have been advertised now. The Board of Aldermen, the Personnel Committee, hopefully will be hiring soon to staff that office. And one of the people we want is someone actually with the ability to prepare fiscal notes and do financial analysis. But that is good for us to have that. That office has existed in our rules for a long time, for many years, and was just never funded. I think that's one of those examples of how we don't often give ourselves the resources we need down here to be successful. Further down on line 20, also updating that line to reflect the previous change. So let's start on line 19. The sponsor of a proposed board bill shall forward the proposed board bill to, and so I would change that to, upon introduction of a proposed board bill, comma, the Office of Legislative Research shall prepare, and then go on to a fiscal note. So I will update all this in written form, and we do not have to pass this today because I do believe that the chairman wanted to weigh in on this too. And the other change I would note on line 21.
First page.
Page 2.
Page 2.
Page 2. Okay. Line 22, let's start on line 20. Fiscal note and following such preparation of the fiscal note shall be forwarded to the sponsor, and I would also add, and the committee which the bill was referred to. So it wouldn't just be the sponsor who got the bill, but it would actually be referred to the entire committee. So those are the additional changes I would make. There's also a section on page 3 noting that change to the Ways and Means Committee. So I would take that on line 4, where it specifically says that the changes are made following consideration by the Ways and Means Committee. I would take out Ways and Means and just say substantive changes are made following consideration by the committee. So whichever committee that's actually referred to, not Ways and Means specifically. So the changes I would make would just infer that All bills don't have to go to Ways and Means Committee. They can go to whatever committee they go to. Any bill, regardless of whatever committee it goes to, would have a fiscal note, and that fiscal note will be prepared here in the legislative branch by the Office of Legislative Research, not relying upon the executive branch to prepare our fiscal notes, although they, like any other department, would be required to supply any necessary information for our Office of Legislative Research to prepare a fiscal note. And with that, I'm open to questions.
Thank you. A couple things. One, I appreciate that, and you could put my name on it. I think it's a move in the right direction, and yeah, you're right. I don't want to take a vote today, but I would like to get Paul to paint the next, because it seems important that we get this and do it right. Having said that, I'm just going to open it up for comments, questions, or whatever, so Alderman Moore.
Yeah. Alderman French, that physical note will be given to the sponsor. So this is in the job description of the new position, and for the other one that you mentioned, that'll be part of their job description from now on, right?
Right. So in the Office of Legislative Research, part of their duties would be to prepare fiscal notes. Those fiscal notes would be supplied to the sponsor of the bill and the committee which the bill was referred to.
There won't be no delay or anything. We'll be able to discuss it in committee. The sponsor will know about it before it goes to the floor.
Correct. Now, will it require some time to prepare a fiscal note? Yes. But for most bills, probably not that long. For most bills passed down here,
Prepared before it's introduced to the committee, right?
before it's passed out of committee. So at the time the board bill is referred to committee, it should have a fiscal note attached.
Okay.
So the one thing I would note, though, is that of the hundreds of bills we pass down here, very few have significant fiscal impact. I imagine this to become routine, like it is in most every other legislative body that I've interacted with. And you know, our Office of Legislative Research will probably be able to prepare these pretty quickly. Many of them may very quickly become standard. So if somebody's asking for a liquor license moratorium, that's going to be standard, probably having zero fiscal impact. And you get so many of those bills every year to become standard. Now, those special bills, the ones we consider every now and then, the big impact bills,
Right.
they may require a couple of weeks of analysis to do a fiscal note. And I think that's due diligence on our part. There should be some time taken. As a deliberative body, there should be some time taken to consider what the cost is going to be. But I don't imagine it slowing down the process very much. And in fact, if there's any of those bills that has a significant financial impact, we probably shouldn't act as quickly as sometimes we do, where we're rushing it out in 3 meetings. If it has $1 million or $2 million of fiscal impact, we should probably take a little time to consider exactly what the cost is.
Deal that's been happening, right?
I've seen it on several occasions where I think there are significant bills being passed out, and for me, the main piece of information that I want is what's it going to cost us, and we're not getting that information. And you know, it shouldn't even be a special request, I think, to get that information. That should just be how business is done. Any decision, we should have a financial analysis of how much it's going to cost.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Alderman Carter.
Thank you for sponsoring this bill. I was shocked coming from the state legislator to see that we didn't do this. This is something, you know, coming from the state legislator, everything that we did, it had a fiscal note attached to it. And sometimes, you know, that even though the bill may have been great, it could have cost us, you know, a ton of money that we didn't have. And so, you know, that kind of changed our mind sometimes on whether to vote a bill out, hold it until next session, or, you know, maybe to, you know, rethink it and possibly do something else. So I was extremely shocked that that we did not to have these fiscal notes with every bill that we passed. I think that it is a responsible way to figure out, about every piece of legislation that we have. So I support this. I want to be added on as a co-sponsor, and I hope that when you do get the language in order, that we pass this with a emergency clause, because this is needed like yesterday. So thanks.
Thank you. Alderwoman Murphy.
No questions at this time.
Thank you.
Alderman Ogilvy.
Thanks. I mean, I definitely support this in concept 100%, but this bill is asking a lot in some cases, I think. Can you talk about maybe some recent bills and how you would guess that they would fit into this framework?
Some recent bills besides the two I named. So for instance, minimum wage bill, the same financial analysis that the budget director did and provided after we passed the legislation, he would just do before we passed the legislation.
Well, okay, for instance, like on the first page, 17, a capital improvement project that increases operating costs over the current adopted city budget. So we do a lot of capital expenditures. I mean, most of them are in the budget. Some are passed, later on. If, let's say somebody renovates a bathroom in a park as part of the budget, does the budget need a fiscal note on the improvement to that bathroom and its impact on the rest of the city's budget? Because somebody might argue that component of the budget bill needs its own fiscal note because renovating the bathroom will decrease maintenance costs. And somebody's gonna have to do that analysis within the budget before we could pass the budget out.
No, I think what you're talking about is, so with Board Bill 1, which is our budget, I think Board Bill 1 is the one bill we passed that has, the whole board bill is basically a fiscal note. All the attached books of information we get details how those expenditures are made. And so in that case, the capital improvement budget that deals with parks is itemized in the parks detail of that budget. So I think in the case that you're talking about is the only time that would take effect or have any effect related to Board Bill 67 was if at some point in the year somebody introduced a bill that said it called for the creation of new bathrooms at a park. This is after we've passed Board Bill 1. This is a separate, independent, separate bill altogether, just dealing with bathrooms in the park. That would have a fiscal note attached. And if they're using existing capital improvement funds that have already been allocated, then the fiscal note would note that this is the source of funds being used to pay for these additional bathrooms. It has zero additional cost to us because that money is already allocated out of that budget. But if it's not coming out of that, it should note where this additional money is coming from before we pass something to say we're going to build new bathrooms, say in O'Fallon Park. So I'll use my park as an example. In O'Fallon Park, if I was to introduce a board bill to say we wanted very nice bathrooms built in O'Fallon Park, I would identify the source of funding as the Major Parks Fund that's already allocated for O'Fallon Park. And so that would have a zero fiscal impact on our general revenue budget because that source of money is already set aside for that. Does that answer your question?
A little bit. I think there's going to be a lot of shades to this, as we start having to comply with this. So I'm just going to maybe throw out some examples and get what your take is. We passed a complete streets ordinance earlier this year, last session. And it creates a complete streets steering committee that requires staff time from a bunch of departments because they're required to meet at least on a quarterly basis. Mm-hmm. It doesn't create any new positions, but it creates an activity that people have to engage in. So does the fiscal impact have to go and figure out, the fiscal note will have to determine who's going to engage in those activities, how much time they're going to spend over the next 2 years doing them, and what percentage of their time, and therefore what the impact to the city's budget is because they're spending X amount of hours on this Complete Streets Committee.
So to answer the broad question is, yeah, that legislation would have, and I think should have, a fiscal note attached. Now, in the preparation of the fiscal note, is the Office of Legislative Research or the City Budget Division calculating down to the hour how much volunteers or how much paid staff? That's up to how they work. But at the end of the day, what the Board of Aldermen needs to consider is how much the total project is going to cost. Now, how they get to that is going to be, that gets into the accounting of the matter and how the different offices generate those numbers. But yeah, that is something that we should consider how much it's going to cost. I don't think a fiscal note, as we've seen with fiscal notes in Jefferson City or in other legislative bodies, get down to the minutia of hours spent on projects, but it does say if there is an executive director, this is how much they make. If it is staff, this is how much it's going to cost. Restriping of city streets, this is how much it's going to cost. These are considerations I think we should always take into account.
So for instance, the Civilian Oversight Board.
Mm-hmm.
So that, if I recall, when we passed the Civilian Oversight Board legislation, it mentions new positions, but those positions were not created and funded in the budget until the next budget cycle, which happened right after civilian oversight passed, but those positions didn't exist when we passed civilian oversight. So the fiscal note to that bill would, the fiscal impact is just the creation of those new positions to the next year's budget.
So in that bill, it created an office. It requires the office to have space, which should have a cost associated to it. It created positions, so an executive director of that should have a fiscal, a note, an estimated cost to that. I think that was it as far as positions. It also assigned an investigator.
Right.
So that should have a cost associated with it. And so I would estimate, all those things tallied up, it may have a effect of about $300,000 or so a year. That should be included in future bills. Absolutely. We should know how much that's going to cost. And we as a body should determine where that's going to come from. Now, in that particular bill, without itemizing specifically how much it all cost, it said it was all going to come out of the public safety budget.
Right. So that's, so the question is just, okay, so we have a bill, it creates a position. That position is not funded in the budget, and personnel has not categorized that position yet or assigned it a salary range. So my concern is just like, yes, when I see a bill, I want to know what does it cost if we pass the bill.
All right.
My concern is sort of the nitty-gritty of how we get there in some of these cases is pretty involved. And so if our legislative, the legislative research of the Board of Aldermen has to call personnel and be like, what is it, what does this position go for? Personnel is going to say that position does not exist. So I don't know, right? I mean, until you put it in the budget, it doesn't exist, and I can't tell you exactly what the salary range for that position would be, potentially.
Okay. So, Alderman, I think you're getting a little caught in the weeds here. So, one, yes, there's the nitty-gritty of what we need to be concerned with as lawmakers, as aldermen, as members of committees, and members of the Board of Aldermen. But I think you're getting into the nitty-gritty of what the accountants are going to do, both in the Office of Legislative Research, the City Budget Division, or in that case, the Personnel Division. My question is that they will come up with an estimate. That they will come up with an estimate, so that's the answer to that. And it will give us a range of how much it will cost. Now, on the state level, sometimes they put it in terms of a range, or they just come up with an estimate. But they'll come up with an estimate.
Do we know how many people work in that capacity in state government?
They have a big office.
Okay. So it's a lot of people.
Alderman Ogilvy, would you want Alderman Carter to answer that since he knows the answer?
I got it, yeah. Right. So we do, a lot of the bills that deal with like tax abatement or some type of incentive.
Those fiscal notes are prepared by the.
I'll ask that one. Yeah, I mean, they
alphabet soup.
have a lot of financial information attached to them already. Sometimes we don't see it all, but a lot of that is done behind the scenes. Is that, in your mind, is that sufficient to meet these requirements?
So like I said, for bills that go through hoods, the chairman has now instructed the alphabet soup, SLDC, CDA, all those folks, to prepare a standard form of how much these things are going to cost. And I think that's a move in the right direction, and I think that would satisfy the requirements of this. And so what under Board Bill 67, what the Office of Legislative Research would do was come up with basically the same kind of format for all of the bills, kind of a standard format of this is what we're looking for as what is the fiscal cost, sources of revenue, where you're going to fund this from, if it's local, if it's state, if it's federal, if it doesn't have an identified source, if it's going to come from general revenue, this is how much it's going to cost. So we would have a standard form for all of that. And so, yeah, and I think to your point of how many people are required to do that, I think that, again, for the vast majority of bills we pass down here, the fiscal impact is minor. And most of the bills we pass down here at this point are standard. So if it's not a development deal, which the fiscal note is already basically prepared by SLDC, if it's a street improvement bill or any other standard bill, we do a liquor moratorium. Once you do the first analysis of how much that costs, that's pretty much going to be standard. Now, for those bills that are the odd bills, the big impact bills, with the minimum wage laws, stadiums, NGA, et cetera, there is a financial impact usually done at some level. Somebody in city government has done an analysis. It's usually how we generate the number associated with what they're asking for, or what we're allocating. The problem is that that number usually isn't, that calculation usually isn't shared with the Board of Aldermen. And I think this Office of Legislative Research would then be the point person to start putting all that stuff together. It wouldn't be up to them alone to create those numbers. And so even, we have a 2 to 3 person office versus a 47 person office in state legislature. It wouldn't be up to these people to crunch all those numbers themselves. They do have the resources of the budget division, of SLDC, of Parks Department, of Comptroller's office, of all other city offices to be able to get those numbers from.
Okay.
I think we're the only department down here that don't have accountants.
Right. So, I mean, again, I share your frustration 100% on, the runaround we get frequently on financial information or how it comes at the 11th hour or worse. I mean, we're 100% on the same page. I just think that the language in this bill is potentially asking for more than that in some cases. And let me just...
Yeah, maybe you can give me an example. I'm not following.
I mean, these are a little bit silly, but I think these are the real things the bill is asking for. So, as it's currently written, you brought up a liquor moratorium, right? So let's say there's an area that does not have a liquor moratorium and enacts a liquor moratorium. So the bill says, is there a direct financial impact on any city department or office? Well, there is, because a lot of the fees from liquor licensing goes to the excise department. So somebody's going to have to do a determination of what are the fees we're giving up by enacting this liquor moratorium based on, how many liquor licenses were issued in that ward over the last 3 years or something, and now new ones won't be issued. I mean, that's what the bill, I think, is saying, and I think that analysis
It should.
is...
So any question you have about, does somebody have to come up with those numbers? The answer is yes, and we should have those numbers.
Right, but my point then is that this is going to be a very large administrative task. I think much bigger than you are making it out to be, that there's just, there's a standard and we can just refer to the standard and we'll do it once and then that'll be the case every time. I mean, the bill isn't
Well,
saying...
even in the case you gave, there would be, even if this office did decide to go to that depth of calculating lost future revenue, it would be a formula created once, and then you would plug numbers into those formula.
Maybe, but there might be, in that particular case, there might be, large differences between how many liquor licenses there are in each area. And so, I don't know. That's kind of my point, though. I don't know if, that is good enough or not.
Yeah, but
good
even
enough.
in that example, I would argue that that would have no effect on our general revenue or the city budget, because it is not reducing anything. And if in your hypothetical you're talking about potentially lost in the future, I don't think the board bill calls for that kind of speculation. It would be different if our normal process for liquor moratoriums stripped existing businesses of liquor licenses. That would have a negative financial impact. You would be able to calculate how much tax revenue those existing bars generated, and that's what we wouldn't have. But usually moratoriums just say that no additional ones will be issued in the future. So I wouldn't say that this bill calls for speculating how many businesses would potentially open over the next 5 years. I don't think it would require that.
So the list of criteria, is this taken from another jurisdiction that requires fiscal notes, or is this something we created here?
This was created by our former lawyer and clerk. I'm not sure what he uses the basis of it, but in reviewing it with him, it seemed pretty comprehensive.
I agree. It's very comprehensive. I would like to see, and I haven't done this, but I'd like to review what the criteria are in jurisdictions that are already doing this, and, cities in particular, and see kind of what level and what categories they're making sure they cover. I would like this information, but we also have to be, I think, a little wary of, you want sort of a, let's say, routine-ish bill done, and suddenly there's a 6-week backlog on getting a fiscal note for it, and, everything grinds to a halt. So I'd be a little more comfortable if I could sort of see this in operation from another city, and see some of, I've seen the state ones, I've seen the, but see what another city is producing that we could base, our policy off of.
Sure. There's lots of different ones you can look at. I recommend Google.
I've heard of that.
But yeah, to your point though, I appreciate your questions. I think a lot of them are, as I said, kind of down to the nitty-gritty, and I would just say that the answer to basically any of those questions is, if it costs something, we should know what it costs, and that's the point of the bill. If it does have any financial impact, we should know. And our office, our newly created positions, will be the point person on assembling that information. I think in most cases, they don't have to generate it themselves. In fact, for the big ticket items, there's usually somebody who has lawyers who prepared that legislation, and they have come up with those estimates for how much this stuff would cost. Absent of that, we've got SLDC, we've got the city budget division, the comptroller's office, the police department has accountants, the fire department has budget folks. Everybody has number crunchers except us.
Okay. it would help me a lot to talk to some of those departments about this bill specifically, so that they can think through, okay, what information do we have, and how could we plug that into the the format essentially that the Board of Aldermen is going to be asking for. Because this,
I don't disagree.
In order to make sure we have a process that works, right? I mean, this.
I just want to point out the irony, though. The irony is that that's exactly what this bill is calling for. Actually, what the bill is calling for is for us more regularly to slow down, to look at what the impact is of these bills, to come up with an analysis in a standard format of how much it's going to cost and what the impact is going to be. So yes, it is ironic that that is what you're asking for here, and I don't think it's inappropriate. Perhaps at the next hearing, we've already discussed having Paul Payne from the Budget Office come here. If there was anybody additional who you wanted to come and testify, I'm sure the chair, the vice chair, would be open to calling them.
Great, thank you.
I would say if, did you want
I had a couple questions.
to, go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman and members of the board. All right, Alderman French, I have a couple of questions. Section 1, number 6, I'm trying to figure out who is making the determination as to whether or not a board bill requires a fiscal note, and I apologize if you've kind of gone through this. So Section 6 says the clerk of the Board of Aldermen shall not assign a board bill to a proposed bill. So my question is primarily just on whose shoulder does the determination of whether a fiscal note is necessary, who does that fall on? And in the case of right now, for example, where we are we're missing a clerk, who is making those determinations? We're clearly moving forward as a board and able to hear legislation, but kind of having a, if we're leaving that decision to the clerk and then having a backup when we don't have one.
Right. So first, the system doesn't work without the people in place. Okay.
This is very true.
So nothing down here is designed to work without a clerk or a lawyer. So we already have a problem. So we have to fill those positions. The Office of Legislative Research will not work if we don't have people in it and we don't fund it. So I think we've finally addressed that. We're funding it. We're hiring people for it. It would be up to the clerk, just like any other board bill, to make sure it's formatted properly and looking at Section 1, if it meets any of these criteria, which I think most bills in some way would, it would be required to have a fiscal note. Now, a fiscal note could have a zero impact. Okay. Many fiscal notes may just say zero, but it's important to have that information. And what I imagine is that it will become standard, as it should, that every bill will have the same sheet attached to the back, and it will show what the sources of funding, if this costs anything, where that funding is coming from, if it falls short, where additional revenue is needed and where that would come from. But like I said, most, I think, will have zero. And that makes the decision for the committee very easy. But those that do, whether it's $10,000 here, $100,000 there, what we know is all that stuff adds up. And we usually get surprised when we get that budget every year, like, where'd all the money go? Mm-hmm. That's where all the money went.
So then it's my understanding that if it's determined that a fiscal note's needed, that the sponsor would then forward it to the budget division, who would then kind of craft a fiscal note. And my question is there, if there is a disagreement between the sponsor then and the budget division or the fiscal note,
Well, so first, I think before you came in, we discussed some changes to the bill.
Okay.
So we're not going to vote this out today. I proposed some amendments. The first one actually changed on page 1, line 3s and 4, where it required all bills requiring a fiscal note to go to Ways and Means. That was not the intention. Every bill should have a fiscal note, regardless of what committee it goes to. So if it's a park bill and it goes to Parks, it should have a fiscal note attached. So that was not the intention. So we proposed changing some language where it specifically required Ways and Means. I think it's in 3 different sections. It mentions Ways and Means. The second was on page 2, line 16. Language would be added. The Office of Legislative Research, in coordination with the City Budget Division, shall be responsible for preparation of fiscal notes. And so one of the things we want to do is not make the legislative branch dependent on the executive branch. And so the legislative branch, where the Office of Legislative Research is, will prepare its fiscal notes. If it needs information, then the City Budget Division can give it. It also goes on to state that city departments and offices shall cooperate in providing any information necessary for the preparation of fiscal notes. So all city departments and offices are required to give whatever information our Office of Legislative Research needs to prepare a fiscal note, but it will be prepared in the legislative branch, not dependent upon the executive branch. And what we know is that the politics of it all is that that would allow the executive branch to really make certain bills look more appealing than others, and we don't want to necessarily give them that, that power or interfere with our own independence as a separate body.
I appreciate that. Then I apologize if you made this change or we talked about it before, but I understand through talking with Alderman Carter that tax abatements would be included in this, looking, kind of quantifying, attaching a fiscal note to tax abatements. And that leads, is that true?
So that would be in there. Now, the good thing is that those bills already go to HUD's, and the HUD's chairman, in his wisdom, as a new chairman there, started requiring that on all of those bills anyway. So what he had SLDC do, the same thing we're talking about doing here with all bills, is prepare a standard form that will show the impact on each of these bills. I thought that was a move in the right direction. And it'll be up to the Office of Legislative Research to work out our form, but I think most of the information that's prepared for that form would satisfy the requirements of this bill.
I think so too. And with that, we look at more than just 2 years out. So I was kind of thinking in terms of this language here, which says we're looking at the fiscal impact for this year and the next in the subsequent year, and perhaps we could think about looking a little bit further out.
Possibly. Now that gets back to the alderman from the 24th concern about adding too much by ordinance on this new office. So I think that could be done by rules. So in here it leaves it up to the new Office of Legislative Research to come up with this form and standard procedures. Yeah, so I think that might be something that we can look at in the rules of it. So for instance, with development bills, we may want to look 5-10 years out versus liquor moratorium bills, you may only want to look at 2 years out. But I'm open to that. If you want to specify that in the bill, I'm open to that.
And so this is only looking at the cost, the fiscal cost to the city government, correct? And not necessarily its impact on business entities, for example, outside of city government. For example, there was a lot of talk about the impact of minimum wage, for example,
Right.
On city government and on the city. So this is just looking at the fiscal impact on city government, correct?
Right, just the fiscal impact on our budget. So in the example I gave earlier about the minimum wage bill, I had requested that information from the budget division, didn't get it until after we passed the law. And that number did not look, that's a big task, to look at the estimated economic impact on the entire city or region and all its employers. But it is a pretty easily generated number about what it would cost us as a city. And what he did was look at raising it to 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. And you can see that it cost us $400,000 to $500,000 at 11 and up to over $2 million a year at 15. So that's the kind of stuff that we would have been provided at the committee level before we passed the bill.
Great. I think that's all I have. I want to again echo Alderman Carter's thanks. I am a data-driven person. I think we should be looking at numbers when we talk about legislation, so I appreciate you starting this conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Alderman Moore had some follow-up questions.
Antonio, last night, I think the mayor invoked some executive privileges on when the guy got shot at the baseball game. He committed the city to more police officers, more visibility, and what we have been struggling with, he committed to last night. That executive privilege that he invoked last night, can we put a tag on that?
Yeah, the mayor does that a lot. He he does spend a lot without telling us exactly how much it's going to cost, and make promises that have a price tag attached to it without telling us where that money is going to come from. So no, unfortunately, this would only, Board Bill 67 would only deal with legislation introduced in the Board of Aldermen, and not promises made by the mayor on television.
Anyone else have any other questions? If we have no other questions, then what we'll do is, I know we'll set a meeting up pretty fast. Are you going to send it as a committee sub? Is that how you're going to?
Yeah, I'll take the changes we talked about today and some of the input from the committee, turn it into a proposed substitute. And if the chair wants to coordinate with Paul Payne to come speak,
That's what I was going to do.
maybe we can do that as soon as Thursday or Friday.
If anyone else wants anyone here at the next meeting, because I think it's, the way it looks, it would probably pass out with no problem, but just to give it all its fair play, we bring them in. If anybody else wants someone else brought in, we should. I mean, I know one of the bills that we haven't talked about that I'd really like to see how it's going to affect, and this would help, is I know they're talking about lowering a lot of the business licenses. And,
Yeah.
you know, I would be interested to see what the fiscal impact to the city is going to be. And so anyway, I would ask them, Scott, I'm sorry.
Can we make sure we have, I mean, there's reference to like bonds and lease purchase agreements and that stuff. So BPS and Comptroller's office work together to make those things happen. Can we make sure we have a representative from those offices to talk about what information they have and how it would fit into this
I would
plan?
ask that everybody would email, like if you email me, I will get that taken care of. So anybody has anybody they want to see, email me. I would hope that at the next meeting, that bring them in and get this wrapped up.
Sure.
And again, I think the flavor of the board seems that, you know. So other than that, I guess we'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you all for coming out.
Thank you.